A lot is happening between India and Maldives as we speak. There is actually a snafu in the bilateral ties. Well, the newly elected Maldivian president is right now in China, but the Twitter, the social media, as well as diplomacy between the two countries are on a boil. Now, all this starts with an innocuous visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Lakshadweep, Indian Twitterati going gaga over it, and some compared it to and as India's response to Maldives, which it actually was not. But then adding to the whole muddle, where some Maldivian ministers, deputy ministers, newly elected ministers, going out and tweeting certain comments, which they eventually deleted, which were not only anti-Modi, but also in a way anti-India, mocking India. From being very close friends to here, how did we really reach here? And for this, I have with me Nicolas Blarel, who is the associate professor of international relations at the Leiden University. And he is someone who's closely followed India's foreign policy, the Southeast Asian region, the Indian Ocean region per se, and also Maldives. And the reason why I'm talking to him is because I came across his excellent article that was co-authored by him last year, which delves into the history of Maldives. Thank you so much for joining at ThePrint, Nicholas.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Nicholas, to begin with, Maldives, what has been the journey so far? Maldives became independent in 1965 and it immediately established ties with India. But the ties with China also date back several decades. Isn't that so?
Yeah, no, actually, as you mentioned, historically, the Maldives' first major relationship has always been structurally, geographically, historically with India. After 1965, India was one of the first countries to recognize the independent state of the Maldives. And as you know, it has had good relations, including India intervening militarily in 1987 after an attempted coup to enforce a certain degree of political stability in the Maldives. So India has always closely followed the Maldivian politics and has been close. I mean, when you look at trade patterns, tourism destination for Indian tourists, etc., it's always been strong relations. That's changed over the last, as you mentioned, maybe 15 years with growing Chinese investments and growing Chinese political attention towards the Maldives, which is basically a strategic choke point for Chinese trade and commercial and energy links with the Middle East. So China has been closely following and is always concerned about maintaining access to these sea lanes of communication. And for them, investing in the Maldives, just as they did in other parts of the Indian Ocean like Sri Lanka, notably in big infrastructure projects for the BRI, the Belt and Road initiatives, you've seen a growing presence, first initially economically, but then growingly strategic and political, and including a visit of Xi Jinping in 2014. And from now then onwards, major investments, and to the point that there's a major debt now that the Maldives owes to China, different entities in China. Yeah.
You rightly mentioned about the fact that while it became independent in 65, it established diplomatic ties with China in 1972. But it has always tried to maintain a balance between the two sides, as in terms of independent foreign policy. It is independent foreign policy, but it strives towards that. But things changed in 1988 when you had a coup against the then president Gayoom, and since then it has really become a very, I would not say pro-India, but closer to India. And India is the net security provider for Maldives since 1991. But what changed? Gayoom was the longest ruler. We had excellent ties between the two sides. Did democracy change things? How do you see it?
Yes, this is actually something we discuss in the chapter that you mentioned I co-authored with Constantino Xavier. It's basically actually the constitutional development, the formation of a new constitution, and actually having multi-party politics change the dynamics. Because what you mentioned, trying to play a little bit both actors and even maybe skewing a little bit more towards India, was facilitated by a kind of a one president or one party rule for many years. And so you could see Maldives opting more towards strategic edging, right? They're edging maybe a little bit more towards India, but they're trying to get from both sides of those relationship, and trying to get anything that would be profitable for the development of the Maldives. Now that changed because the polarization of politics that comes with the constitutional development and the democratization, I think, and the move to a multi-party system in the Maldives led to actually a polarization on being pro-India or pro-China. And what you saw in the last two elections, 2018, when there was a change, Mohamed Soli came to power after development of closer relations with China and basically campaigning on moving back to India first policy. You see now with the election last year of Mohamed Moizu of a different approach, which is now India out and a more strong pro-China leaning. So you see the polarization among the MDP and the PPD, yes, sorry, about being one PPD being pro-China and MDP being pro-India, and you see this. It actually, if you look at the coverage, international coverage of the last elections, no one talked about domestic politics. It was all about which one aligns closer to India or China. So this is actually we've seen over the last few years, and when the electoral outcome will decide a little bit of the foreign policy orientation of the country.
When President Nasheed won the first democratic elections way back in 2008, he was seen as someone who was close to India, but he's also someone who reached out to China too, right? Yeah. Maintaining that balance. But then, Nasheed was ousted in what was known as a judicial or a political coup. And things went for a downfall since, I think, that's the time around when the Chinese also opened its embassy in Malé for the first time. That was in 2011, 2012. Yeah. You had the whole GMR fiasco where India was supposed to build the airport. And then the new government came in and kicked out GMR and brought in the Chinese.
Yeah. Brought in a state-owned company from China. So this is when a lot of the new contracts that were negotiated, or at least had been initially allocated to Indian companies, were moved to Chinese companies, or where the tenders were a little bit more competitive than even used to be. And so you saw these edging that happened under Nasheed, moving towards a maybe more pro-China orientation. And you see now this polarization along these lines. And so the developmental policies or programs of whether it is Abdullah Yameen or Mohamed Nasheed and then Mohamed Soli, their developmental policies aligning more closely with infrastructural projects, whether coming from India's Sagar neighborhood policies, or the BRI on the other side. And so this is where you see these diverging developmental projects aligning more with one regional project of the other. These two great powers competing in the region.
When Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, at that time in Maldives, you had a very pro-China government. It was of Mohammed Wahid Hassan, and then, he continued till about 2018, which had its own tensions with India because it was considered as pro-China. A lot of projects, as you rightly mentioned, went to China, and the debt also kept increasing. Yeah. And in 2018 is when Soli was sworn in as the president, and he was someone who understood the Chinese debt trap. And in 2019, Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Maldives and ended up giving a credit of about $1.3 billion to stave off the Chinese debt. Isn't that so?
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's a close number. I mean, there's different numbers that actually pushed by both sides. It's actually Mohamed Nasheed also, I think, inflates a little bit the debt numbers, but I think they're quite high, especially when you compare to the 1.5 billion investments of China, when you look at the 5 billion budget total of the Maldives or GDP in the Maldives. So, I mean, again, these are important numbers of debt, and the Indian investment or aid offer of 1.5 billion was actually quite close to the initial Chinese investment. So in the numbers, there's actually quite, I think, competitive positioning, and this really helped the Mohamed Soli, and because Mohamed Soli and his government also wanted to get out of the free trade agreement that the previous government had got into, which they considered was not in the benefit of the trade balance with China, and in the massive import of Chinese products. So this was also creating a further addition of strategic or economic dependence beyond the debt trap that they had fallen into. So this was welcome, but it also came with also Indian net security provisions that were criticized by the opposition, which is now in power. This also the development of military presence in the region, and notably in the Maldives. Again, also inflated by the opposition with the India Out campaign. We're talking about 70 so soldiers, mainly there to help or train the local military, help with humanitarian considerations. But this was a major salient issue, I think, in the campaign, because it was considered to be a sovereignty issue, which the opposition pushed.
The new president came in, one of the first things that he did was visit Turkey. Traditionally, well, if you go by past practice, Maldivian presidents visit India first, but he was making it a point by not visiting India. India is still not on his visitation plan. Mm-hmm. You mentioned about tourism. Maldives depends heavily on tourism. While, Maldives is known as luxury tourism itself. And I would have assumed that, not many Indians would actually be visiting Maldives, except for the rich and the celebrities. But when I look at the figures, India happens to be the second largest section of people who visit Maldives, the first being Russians, the second being Indians. So when there's a boycott call by Indians, and by Twitter, it is not by the government, but by individuals per se, how do you think this comes into play? Does this force Maldives on the back foot?
I think it does. If you look at the reaction of the Maldivian government, immediately reacting, suspending the three youth deputy ministers who have been who were the culprits behind the initial tweets, and then the official apologies today of the Maldivian government that this was not the government policy or position that wants to maintain good neighborhood relations. This is interesting because I think this first time you see this government backtracking. As you mentioned, there was a sort of diplomatic sight by not following the informal pattern of the first visit of Maldivian president to be India, going to Turkey. The Maldivian president didn't go all the way to go to China for his first trip. He's going later this week. But he went to Turkey, but it's also not a close ally of India. It's at its own relationship with Turkey for the last few decades. So it's a show that, it's a show that it wants to expand relationships and edge with other players in the broader region, but not only solely with China, even though there's a pro-China tilt clearly with this government, but also looking at the Gulf and Turkey as other relationship, and it doesn't want to depend exclusively on India. And it's also one of the first decisions of Muizu was also to ask for the withdrawal of the Indian troops of that small contingent in the Maldives. So again, there was these signals that were given to India, and then these tweets, I think, crossed this red line. And it's interesting that you say it's not an official Indian policy that is leading to them to basically withdraw or to try to redress or to correct the relationship. It's the Twitter reaction, celebrities from Bollywood saying that they won't go to travel, and giving that you say the first tourism kind of the first group of tourists are coming from Russia, and giving the restriction that Russians have traveling, this could also be could actually be even more dependent on Indian tourists. So again, this is something that they'll have to consider, and it could be an interesting sign for the Indian government that there are ways that they can inflict also some cost and show that they can signal that there are red lines to the Maldives trying to develop or to diversify its trade relations, because it also depends a lot of India on other issues. Yeah.
And a lot of Indian companies operate multiple resorts in Maldives. So all the resorts which cost about $800,500 a night are actually owned by Indian companies. You mentioned that this has an impact, and the Maldivian government has backtracked for the first time. But where do you see this going from here? Do you think that this is just a social media, a tiff, which will eventually get over once the diplomats come into play? But how do you see this relationship going ahead?
I mean, it shows the limits of the Maldivian government as it sees some of the dilemmas because there are structural relations with India. The tourism connection is a structural thing that they can't basically try to evade or get away with. They're not going to increase tourism coming from other countries in the immediate and very economically dependent on India on multiple levels. Geographic proximity and the entire Indo-Pacific.
Tourism, by the way, a big thing because a lot of Maldivians that I personally know of, they come to India for medical treatment.
Yeah, no, also, yeah. So you could see during the pandemic, the dependence also on provision also on vaccines from India. There's many issues on which China could be an alternative, but many issues where the Maldives will still be structurally dependent on what this new government wants to do. And there's also the accountability. The opposition, if you notice, the previous president, the previous foreign ministers, they all jumped on this, exploited this to criticize the current government because there's this strong friendship with India. So they have to take this into account. They won't also be able to replace India and China with Gulf relationships or Turkey immediately. So it's they have to be very careful to basically balance between these two relationships. And one of the other things is the Maldives is in the middle of the Indo-Pacific kind of struggle, right? So the U.S. is also a close observer. The U.S. has opened an embassy and has its first ambassador in the last few years under Biden coming to the Maldives. And the U.S. is more aligned with Indian interests than with Chinese interests. The Maldives also has to take this into account as it looks towards the future, that it will have to manage and carefully tread between these different stakeholders in the region that will be trying to push or to leverage these different relationships, where different economic aid or tourism diplomacy to get the Maldives to align one way or the other when it comes to China.
Well, you're absolutely right, and it is hope that Maldivian government realizes this, because as I was, we do a 50-word edit, and before coming here, I was just writing that edit, and which mentions the fact that while Go India, Quit India, and all happened, elections are over. The realities of Chinese debt and age-old friendship still, comes into play now. But thank you so much, Nicholas, for speaking to the print, and I'm sure that our viewers had a good insight from you into the historical background of the India-Maldives ties. And we look forward to having you more on the print, Nicholas.
Yeah, look forward to it. And thanks again for having me, Snehesh.